Picture this. A quiet afternoon in the English countryside, harvest time, the kind of golden light that makes everything look soft and safe. And then a scream cuts through a field in Suffolk, because 2 children have just crawled out of a wolf pit, and their skin is green. Not pale, not sickly, green. And here's the bit that should make the hairs on your arms stand up. This isn't some campfire story passed down by drunk villagers. This was written down, twice, independently, by 2 monks who had absolutely no reason to lie, and one of them, by his own admission, didn't even believe it himself until the evidence piled up too high to ignore. So let's get our bearings, because place matters here. We're in the village of Woolpit, Suffolk, in the heart of East Anglia. The name itself is a clue, Wolf Pit, Old English for wolf pit, because medieval villagers across this region dug deep trenches to trap wolves that preyed on livestock. It's the kind of name that sounds almost too fitting for what's about to happen, except it isn't fiction. This is documented English history, and the timing lines up with the reign of King Stephen, somewhere in the middle of the 12th century, a period already soaked in civil war, famine, and a kind of low-grade dread that hung over the countryside. Now, the sources. This is where Woolpit earns its place as one of the strangest entries in medieval English record-keeping. The first account comes from Ralph of Coggeshall, Abbot of Coggeshall Abbey, who wrote it into his Chronicon Anglicanum not long after the events were said to have happened. The second, and arguably more compelling account, comes from William of Newburgh, a Yorkshire historian known for being sharp, sceptical, and frankly a bit dismissive of tall tales. William wrote in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum that he was reluctant to include the story at all until the sheer weight of corroborating testimony from multiple separate witnesses left him no choice. 2 chroniclers, 2 different parts of the country, telling essentially the same story. That's not how folklore usually behaves. Folklore drifts and mutates with every retelling. This didn't. So what actually happened, according to both of them? During the harvest, labourers working the fields near one of the wolf pits heard something. Crying, maybe, or just noise where there shouldn't be any. And when they went to look, they found 2 children standing at the edge of the pit, a boy and a girl, and their skin, every inch of it that was visible, was green. Not painted, not bruised. Green, head to toe, in a way nobody in that village had ever seen on a living person. Their clothing was just as wrong. The chroniclers describe it as being made from a material nobody in Woolpit could identify, not wool, not linen, not anything locally produced or traded. And when the children opened their mouths to speak, what came out wasn't English. It wasn't French, the language of the Norman aristocracy. It wasn't Latin, the language of the church. It was something nobody present could place at all. You can imagine the scene. A field full of harvesters, mid-September probably, standing frozen around 2 terrified, green-skinned children, speaking in tongues nobody understood. Fear and curiosity in equal measure. Someone eventually made the decision that any sensible medieval Englishman would make when faced with something inexplicable, bring it to the local lord. The children were taken to the home of a knight in the area, and the village tried, as best it could, to work out what on earth had just walked out of the ground. And this is where the story takes its first genuinely unsettling turn, because the children wouldn't eat. Days passed. Food was offered: bread, meat, whatever a Suffolk household in the 12th century would have on hand, and the children refused every single thing. They grew weaker, thinner. The household must have started to wonder whether these 2 strange arrivals were simply going to waste away in front of them, having survived whatever ordeal brought them here, only to starve in an English manor house. Nobody in that house knew it yet, but the answer to keeping them alive was sitting right there in the fields they'd just walked out of. Something so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it took desperation to even think of trying it. And what happened next, the discovery that saved 1 child, and the slow, quiet death that claimed the other, is where this story stops being strange and starts being something closer to tragedy. We'll get there, but first sit with this. Two monks, writing independently in different parts of England, both recording the same impossible morning in a Suffolk field. That alone should tell you this isn't a story that was ever meant to be forgotten. It was beans that saved them. Green beans, pulled fresh from the field, still sealed in their pods. Somebody in that household, out of either luck or sheer desperation, offered the children unripe beans instead of cooked food, and something in them recognized it. They tore the pods open with an urgency that suggested they hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer, but they didn't eat the beans the way anyone expected. They went for the stalks first, the hollow stems inside the pods, and seemed almost confused when they found nothing there. It was only once they worked out that the food was inside the pod itself that they started eating properly, hollowing out bean after bean, and for a long stretch of time, that was the only thing they would touch. Not bread, not meat, just beans, plucked green and raw. It kept them alive, but only one of them stayed that way. The boy never really recovered. Even with food finally in him, he grew weaker by the week, and not long after the household arranged for both children to be baptized into the church, which tells you something about how this medieval community processed the inexplicable. By trying to fold it into the familiar rites, they understood he died. The chroniclers don't dwell on it for long, which is almost more haunting than if they had. A few lines, and he's gone. A child who crawled out of the ground speaking a language nobody recognized, who never got the chance to explain where he came from, buried in Suffolk soil among people who never understood a word he said. His sister lived, and what happened to her over the following months is, frankly, the part of this story that should unsettle you more than the green skin ever did. She started eating other foods beyond the beans, slowly, cautiously. And as her diet changed, so did her coloring. The green began to fade, bit by bit, until what was left was an ordinary pale English complexion, no different from anyone else in that household. She learned the language around her, English words first in fragments, then in sentences, until eventually she could hold a conversation. The household absorbed her. She grew up there, was later recorded as working as a servant in the home of a knight named Sir Richard de Calne, near a place called Wykes. By most accounts, she lived out something close to an ordinary English life. After that, some versions even say she married. The girl who arrived green and unintelligible became, over time, almost indistinguishable from everyone around her. But before that transformation was complete, while she still remembered, and could finally put it into words, she told them where she'd come from. And this is the part of the Woolpit story that nobody has ever fully explained. She described a land she called St. Martin's Land, not a village, not a country in any conventional sense, a place where, according to her, there was no sun, only a kind of permanent twilight, a soft green-tinted glow that never brightened into proper day and never darkened into proper night. Everyone there, she said, had skin the same color hers once was. Her homeland was separated from this one, she claimed, by a wide river, on the far side of which lay a luminous country that could be seen but never reached. She told them how she and her brother had been tending sheep when they heard something. Bells, ringing, though from where she couldn't say. They followed the sound. It led them through some kind of cavern, a passage through rock, and somewhere along that journey the twilight gave way to something blinding. They emerged into full daylight, into a field near Woolpit, disoriented and overwhelmed by a brightness their eyes had never had to process before. That sudden, violent exposure to ordinary sunlight, she suggested, was part of what had made them so weak when they first appeared. Sit with that detail for a second. Bells leading them through a passage between worlds. A green twilight on one side, blinding daylight on the other. It's the kind of imagery that sounds lifted from folklore about the Fae, about hollow hills and underground kingdoms that English country tales have circled around for centuries, except this wasn't presented as folklore by the men who recorded it. This was presented as testimony, a girl's own account of her own life, taken down by a skeptical historian who had no interest in romanticizing it. So where was St. Martin's Land? Nobody, then or now, has ever pinned it down with certainty. And that gap, that refusal of the story to resolve itself neatly, is exactly why it has survived 8 centuries while countless other medieval tales faded into nothing. Because the next question isn't really, what was St. Martin's Land? It's whether the answer is something far stranger than a hidden kingdom, or something far more grounded than anyone in that Suffolk household could have imagined at the time. Here's where the historians step in, and where the story starts to fracture into competing explanations, none of which fully close the case. The first theory is medical, and it's worth taking seriously because it's grounded in something doctors still see today. Chlorosis, a form of severe iron deficiency anemia that, in extreme cases, can give the skin a distinct greenish pallor. It was common enough in malnourished children in medieval England, where famine and food scarcity weren't rare events but recurring realities, especially during the chaos of King Stephen's reign. Under this theory, the children weren't otherworldly at all, they were simply starving, possibly lost in the woods for an extended period, surviving on whatever scraps they could find, their bodies pushed into a state severe enough to alter their colouring. And the detail that the green faded as the girl ate a proper, varied diet fits this theory almost too neatly. Iron deficiency, treated by food, resolving over time. It's clean. It's plausible. It's also, frankly, a little unsatisfying, because it doesn't account for everything in the original record, the language nobody recognized, the unfamiliar clothing, the consistency of 2 separate chroniclers describing a green so distinct it stopped an entire harvest in its tracks. The second theory takes a different route entirely, and it leans on real political history rather than medical speculation. In 1173, a few decades after the supposed events at Woolpit, there was a massacre of Flemish immigrants at the Battle of Fornham, not far from Suffolk at all. Flemish settlers had been arriving in parts of eastern England for years, working as weavers and labourers, and in periods of political instability, they became targets. Under this theory, the 2 children were the orphaned offspring of Flemish refugees, hiding in the countryside, possibly in the aftermath of violence against their community. Their clothing would have looked foreign because it was foreign continental, unfamiliar to rural Suffolk eyes. Their language would have sounded incomprehensible because it likely was Flemish, a tongue that bore no resemblance to the English, French, or Latin spoken in that household. And St. Martin's Land? Some historians have pointed to a real village nearby called Fornham St. Martin, close enough in name that an oral retelling, distorted across years and translations, could plausibly have warped one into the other. It's a compelling theory. It roots the entire legend in documented historical violence rather than the supernatural. But it still leaves that one stubborn detail hanging there, unresolved, the same way it has for 800 years the green skin, described not as pale or sickly, but distinctly, repeatedly, as green. Malnourishment can explain a pallor. It struggles to fully explain that. And that's really the heart of why this story has never been allowed to die quietly into the footnotes of medieval English history. Every explanation gets you most of the way there, and then leaves a gap just wide enough for doubt to live in. Maybe that's the most honest place to leave it, not with a tidy answer, but with the same uncertainty William of Newburgh himself wrestled with 8 centuries ago, a skeptical man who still couldn't bring himself to dismiss what so many witnesses had told him. What's certain is that Woolpit never let the story go. Walk through the village today, and you'll find it on the official village sign, 2 small green children standing beneath a tree, a permanent fixture in the heart of Suffolk. There's a pub nearby that carries the legend in its name too. This isn't a tale kept alive by tourists or YouTube videos, it's a story the village itself chose to keep. generation after generation, embedding it into the physical landscape rather than letting it fade into obscurity like so much other medieval folklore did. So a question worth sitting with: a starving refugee child stumbling out of a wolf pit after watching her community torn apart, or a girl from somewhere genuinely, inexplicably other, describing a green twilight world on the far side of a river nobody has ever found. 2 monks believed one of those was worth writing down for history. 800 years later, we still can't decide which one we believe either. If this is the first time you've heard the Woolpit story, you're not alone. It's one of the most overlooked pieces of genuinely documented English folklore out there, sitting quietly in Suffolk, while far less credible tales get all the attention. So tell me, down in the comments, chlorosis, Flemish refugees, or something this village has never quite managed to explain away. If this one gave you chills, hit like. It genuinely helps more people stumble onto stories like this. And if you want more of England's strangest, best documented mysteries, the ones with actual historical receipts behind them, subscribe, because there are plenty more buried in the archives waiting to come out. Share this with someone who'd argue with you about the answer. See you in the next one.